I should start by saying that this is about a translation that hasn't been yet completed. So it is work in progress on multiple levels, so please bear with me. Okay, so what I'd like to do is to look at the implications of cultural specificity in translation and examine, of course, in Venuti's words, the spectrum between how much a translation assimilates a foreign text to the translating language and how much it signals the differences of that text. And in the process, I shall be looking at the source or foreign text and the target or translated text, and look at both of them as embedded in their respective cultural norms to emphasize the idea of negotiation between the two, rather than privilege one or the other. As Rainer Schulte pointed out, translators never come to rest. They are constantly in two places at the same time by building associations that carry the foreign into the known of their own language. And my aim is to test, with reference to my practice, the extent of this dual presence. I'd also like to nuance this multiplicity with my own kind of identity as a migrant in another language, as well as place, and own up to the fact that I actually translate into a language that was not the first one that I acquired in early childhood. I translate out of my mother tongue, which is Hungarian, into English, which is the language of my education and the language that has been predominantly spoken by me and around me for about the last 20 years. So I feel that it's legitimate for me to do this, to translate in this direction, even though the version of English that I may be using couldn't always be classified as standard, whatever that might mean. Okay, so translation, in my understanding, sheds light on the interplay between the familiar and the unknown. And I consider translations as part of a continuum of transnational and multilingual texts, where the question of native versus foreign is really not the main concern. I also wish to interrogate the issue of ownership over language and the idea of purity in a linguistic sense, proposing a model whereby languages are available for cultural reclamation by anyone who has the ambition to extend, in Wittgenstein's words, the limits of their world. Of course, words can fail us, but this can happen, I think, in any language, native or otherwise. And instead of lamenting this or feeling excluded, I suggest to seek empowerment by embracing, if you like, this aesthetic of failure. As Charles de Gaulle pointed out at a recent talk, writing in another language can help convey ideas that may not be possible to communicate in one's first language. And she notes that one language is often insufficient to express her thoughts. And for this reason, she translates and uses one word to find another word, trying to write, quote, a text that is alive and true for both cultures, unquote. For me, translation is a form of writing, and the freedom of not being a native speaker actually allows for a more relaxed approach to what is permissible. In the case of spoken language, for instance, as you can hear, non-native accents can open up multiple levels of access, something that perhaps stays out of bounds for those who contemplate translation as a very strict transfer from one national literature or culture to another. Following José Saramago, I consider that translators make universal literature, even if, in Marina Warner's words, translation is being in the wake of another culture. I suggest that translation is a dialogic phenomenon that braids together rather than separates. Translation, of course, is foreignising in that it should acknowledge the work's origin in another culture, but it should also be rooted in the translator's parallel interest in both source and receiving cultures. And in this way, my concern is not so much with translation as an interlinguistic transfer to achieve another independent product, or the overlap between translation and imitation, but with instituting a practice whereby translations are written with and for their originals, and are inscribed, following Bakhtin, into a continuum of works commenting on another. As Bakhtin argues, dialogic works conduct an ongoing conversation with one another, and they don't just simply react, but inform and are informed by previous works. For Bakhtin, influence can take place at the level of the individual world, and all language and thought has a dialogical dimension. This implies that everything anybody has ever said is a response of sorts to things that have already been uttered, and of course is an anticipation of things that will be said in the future. From the point of view of translation, this celebration of intertextuality can be extremely fruitful, I believe, as it implies that meaning is relative and that a multitude of meanings are possible, which are being negotiated in a complex way of intended and perhaps sometimes unintended scenarios. However, as we know, the dominant pattern in the Anglo-American theatre tradition continues to privilege the familiar over the unknown and offer exposure to works that fit in the most neatly with current practices. And this is fueled, of course, by the practice to commission native playwrights to create English versions of texts, often based on literal, as we know. This practice hinders the celebration of difference and also limits the range of currently available dramatic and dramaturgical models. In Venuti's critique, this approach reduces the foreign norms to target language values and, of course, erases cultural specificity and creates a text which appears to have been written in the target language. To counter this, in my view, theatre translation has a political as well as aesthetic dimension. And it is the translator's responsibility to deal with the slippery interface between making a translated work accessible in the target culture and yet maintain its distinctive cultural specificity. Deleting the traces of borrowing and encouraging excessive fluency in English may appear, of course, the best way of integrating that product into the indigenous canon, or at least make it appealing. But this often comes at the risk of potentially depleting the translated work from its uniqueness. In my practice as research project, dealing with the English translation of András Visky's very recent 2016 radio play Temetetlenek, the Unburied, I wanted to signal the foreignness of the source text and was also aware of the, if you like, political responsibility of working from a minor to a major language. Of course, I want this work to reach an audience in English, but I'm reluctant to obtain this at the cost of blurring the boundaries between the different contexts in which UK theatre and Hungarian, and in this case Transylvanian theatre, operates. For this reason, I was careful to avoid interventions that might transform the source text into a version that only evokes the initial, as Jeanette would put it, and concentrate instead on teasing out that benchmark where the source text is still identifiably foreign, yet relatable and intelligible in the receiving culture. And to a degree, works by authors writing in minority languages, which is Visky's case, already chart this territory, as they are almost always simultaneously received by an audience in their initial language and by another that accesses it through the medium of translation. Visky's theatre stems from the Transylvanian province of Romania, and whilst it is written and performed in Hungarian, it is intended for an audience that also includes speakers of Romanian. And the Hungarian Theatre of Cluj, where Visky works, routinely surtitles their productions in Romanian and increasingly now in English, aiming to be an inclusive platform, opening up towards, if you like, a global network of spectatorship rather than serving a linguistically homogeneous community. When translating this play, I wanted to do justice to this idea of inclusiveness, in addition to being sensitive to Visky's very open dramaturgy. There are very few stage directions and limited indications as to setting and time frames. So in other words, the play could potentially take place anywhere at any point. Being an author who considers the playtext as a blueprint towards subsequent stage productions, Visky is known for his generosity in terms of cooperating on the mise en scène. He embraces a post-dramatic approach to theatre making, and he acknowledges the textual as only one dimension of the performance. And I'll let you read this long quote. but he allows, in principle, subsequent developments of theatrical images in rehearsal, and he participates in the rehearsal process. In fact, he's a professional dramaturg as well, so he knows, if you like, the process from a variety of perspectives. Important to stress at this point that he tends to steer clear of dialect in his plays, as his work is affiliated to the non-representational trend in theatre, if you like, that is structured by ritual, metaphor, poetic images. He started off as a poet, and this sort of persona of his is constantly present in all his writing. His register, viewed from an Anglo-American perspective, I suppose we could say, is relatively high. However, this tends not to be perceived in Hungarian productions as a problem or an obstacle to relatability, but a way to mark the universal. Because, as I said before, these plays and situations can potentially be relevant to anyone in various circumstances. The play, remind you of the title, The Unburied, the Saint of Darkness, is written for 10 voices, and at first sight is an allegory, hold tight, of Mother Teresa's life, establishing a parallel between her sense of vocation and Antigone's duty to bury her brother. They both defy the values of their respective systems. Teresa first leaves her homeland for India, and then the Order of the Sister of Loreto, to fulfill her true calling, to care for the genuinely needy, the unburied. And the sea of unburied bodies is a recurring metaphor in the play that not only links Teresa's life to that of Antigone, but of course also foregrounds the current migration crisis. And this idea, this need to bury the dead, is an act of justice and an acceptance of our responsibility for our acts as human beings. Bearing this in mind, in my process, part of which I am working with Foreign Affairs Theatre Company on a program called Foreign Affairs Translates 2016, I experimented with different levels of interpretation. Initially, I created a very open text in a fairly neutral language that felt like a blank slate that could be developed. At this stage, I didn't really want to pin down who Teresa really was. I wanted to explore whether it was possible to create a text in English that allowed for this multiplicity that Hungarian inherently contains. I know from personal conversations with Visky that he wrote the play feeling utterly powerless in the face of the current migration crisis and the stance of the Hungarian official politics. But there isn't a single word in the text that would make this connection explicit. And to date, there haven't been any Hungarian productions. There was only a rehearsed reading. So we don't know to what extent the mise en scène would perhaps develop these connections. So my dilemma as a translator was whether I should make connections to the political situation in Hungary. So would Teresa be, let's say, a Hungarian girl watching her government tighten the borders, or maybe reference instead a local context in the UK? And if I did that, opting for this, would the translation need to be rooted in domesticating strategies? Also, when would the exchanges between the young girl and the father be happening? Today or in the past? What does universality and timelessness mean in terms of translation? And the more I pick these possibilities, the more I realize that these decisions have to be taken because they would influence the process early on. So one cannot delay this ad infinitum. In my first draft, I tried to stay very close to Visky's choices in terms of register. And since he incorporates fragments verbatim from Mother Teresa's diary, I integrated extracts of these from the available English translation of the book called Come Be My Light. And in this way, I ended up with a range of words of very high register, lots of Latinate terms, and biblical ones, of course, as well. And following Mother Teresa's style, I refrained from spoken language structures. So in other words, my choice of terminology was intentionally loyal to the source text. And if it wasn't outright unsympathetic, then it wasn't primarily concerned with the challenge for performance, or indeed the expectations of the audience who may be used to hearing spoken language in theatre. At this point, I tested out my translation with a group of actors as part of my collaboration with Foreign Affairs. And I realized actually that for skilled actors, the problem of speakability is not as massive as I thought before. However, the impact of the work in performance might be other than anticipated by the translator sitting at home thinking about political issues. And unlike the Hungarian version, where despite citations from Mother Teresa, the text is able to maintain its universality, in English this wasn't really the case. And by layering my version with a historically distant translation, I was actually situating my English version in a time and space that I didn't really want to. And also by citing Mother Teresa verbatim, I was making a choice actually prior to discussion with the theatre company as to her identity. So this made me aware that the staging of Otherness needs to be done in alternative ways, and following further discussions, in particular with William Gregory, who's my mentor on the program, I decided to translate the verbatim extracts from Mother Teresa myself rather than borrow them, and to do away with a bunch of Latinate and high register words. However, my motivation wasn't just to domesticate, it was to highlight that the Teresa figure is actually an ordinary woman to whom extraordinary things have happened. She even comments that Antigone would talk in beautiful words, something I'm unable to do. So allowing her to sound normal has become a matter of urgency, overriding concerns of equivalence and so on. So I swapped, I have a nice range of words for you to enjoy here. I swapped moribund for dying, vocation for calling, etc. and introduced abbreviations to mark spoken language structures, because what I wanted at this point is to avoid Teresa sounding formal. This level of intervention allowed the translated text to approach the sense of universality the Hungarian original has, despite using a vocabulary of high register. In other words, reverting to strategies familiar to us from the arsenal of domestication have actually ended up playing a different role in this context, and in my view contributed to situating the translated English text into a closer dialogue with its precursor than if I had slavishly followed correspondences for each and every single word. However, with view to potential productions in the UK, further decisions need to be taken as to the actual context in which Teresa operates. And I'm at this stage now. I'll just talk about projects very, very briefly. So what I'm doing now is I'm creating an English version assuming that Teresa is a Hungarian woman who defies so this is the neutral text. And in a second, I'll switch and show you the Teresa as a Hungarian woman version, assuming that she's a Hungarian woman who defies the political regime in her country. In this sense, she's a foreign woman, seen from the perspective of an English-speaking audience. And her vocabulary would reflect this, though I wish to avoid any patronizing attempts at showcasing what a supposedly broken English of an Eastern European person might be. My Hungarian Teresa will be engaged with an interplay of languages, following Bakhtin heteroglossia as intratextual dialogue is emblematic for the correlation between language and worldview, yet she will speak grammatically correct English. Akin to Visky's Hungarian text, her speech will not be anchored in dialect, but in places she will show signs of linguistic disunity by mixing register and using dated slang or exclamations. Due to her accent, in performance, rhyme could operate in different ways, and in novel ways, in fact, and in this sense bring a different punctuation to the rhythm of the production. The frequent Hungarian exclamation Uramisten could be conveyed in a variety of ways, from retaining the original God Almighty to more colloquial equivalents such as blimey, crikey, bloody hell, etc., to suggest that non-native speakers often cover a relatively broad spectrum in terms of register, slipping in and out of their comfort zone and indeed competence when tired or under psychological pressure, which of course happens in the play. Just very quickly, I'm also tempted to work on another version where the play is set in post-Brexit England, and I'm contemplating the situation of a woman in a socially deprived area of East London, because I feel that this is politically as important as highlighting Hungarianness. However, reinterpreting a source text culture or temporal setting requires domesticating strategies to a degree, and arguably is a marker of adaptation. And here we are entering another slippery territory for which we do not have time, but this is what I'd like to tease out, how far I could go in this process. Also, in this case, I do not feel that I could do this translation work on my own, so it would be a collaborative practice, that collaborative fusion that was mentioned earlier, and I would very much like to get involved in that. And I'm just really looking for my conclusions now, because I think my time is up. What I try to say is that theatre translation is an artistic and political undertaking carried out for the purposes of stage production. This should be done in a way that is respectful to the play's cultural specificity, not obliterating its foreignness, but instituting a practice whereby translations are written with and for their originals and are inscribed into a continuum of works that inform one another. Even if the source text contains the germs for multiple options for mise en scène, this multiplicity can be treacherous in translation, and decisions need to be taken as to location and background of protagonists, etc. Thus, instead of creating one single English language version to be all things to all people, as Visky's Teresa says at one point in the play, the translator may need to consider creating several alternative drafts or versions in the receiving language, some merging with what is often defined as adaptation, in response to the specific cultural references and context that the production would wish to explore. Thank you.